How many Malaysians have heard of Ferdinand Magellan? How many people have heard of Lapu-Lapu? Okay. Now, Lapu-Lapu was the guy who killed Magellan when he arrived in the Philippines in Mactan, right? Which is a place near Cebu. He's the guy who killed Magellan. Now, we even celebrate Magellan's voyage, 1519 to 1521. So 2019 and between 2019 and 2021, many parts of the world celebrated, commemorated. But in Malaysia, did we even think about Lapu-Lapu? Now, why is Lapu-Lapu important? He was the ruler of Mactan. He's important because he killed Magellan, because Magellan was basically a colonizer. He was exploring land for the Spanish rulers, looking for resources, for spices, and to colonize. So Lapu-Lapu was engaged in an anti-colonial battle, basically. Why is he not our hero? Of course, in the Philippines he is, but he should be our hero too.
Hello Internet, this is once again Kopitiam Council, and today we are in a studio again, Adi.
Once again, we are at KL Podcast Studio. If any of you cut last week's episode, then you would know what to expect, because we did say that we have something special this time around. So Hafiz, can you tell us what is on the menu for today?
Oh yes, we've been waiting for this long time, and finally we got the man himself in the same room with us. And today we have, before I go to introduce that, because Adi, I would like to introduce something new here. I would like to incorporate AI in our episode, which is I will ask AI who is our guest. So based on that response, I will read to all of you. So basically what AI tells me about Prof is that he is a renowned sociologist and educator from the National University of Singapore. Professor is celebrated for his groundbreaking work on decolonizing knowledge, his deep dives into sociology of religion, and his influence writings on the East-West dichotomy. So that's quite accurate, Prof?
Okay, now we know that AI exaggerates.
All right. And we don't usually have our first-time guest here, but let's find out about something, his background and his family background first. Prof, so could you tell us about your surname, Alatas, because we know about your uncle, your father, and of course your cousins. Could you tell us a bit of your family?
Well, when you ask about Alatas, the background is that on my father's side, of course, the Alatas originate from Hadramaut, which is in the southern part of Yemen. And people from that part of Yemen had been migrating to different parts of the Indian Ocean area, you can say, for centuries, to East Africa, to the southern part of India, to the west coast of India, and of course to this part of the world, with, I suppose, the largest numbers going to Indonesia during the last few hundred years. Yeah, and of course many came to the Malay Peninsula. Yeah.
Could you tell us more so members of your extended family who are actually in the academia?
Well, I think many of my ancestors were academics, not in the modern sense, in the traditional sense. You know, they were scholars. They were some of them were Sufis, some of them were scholars of Sufism, of literature, of history. But in terms of my very immediate family, I suppose it really started with my father and my uncle. My father, Syed Farid Alatas, and my uncle, Syed Nagib Alatas. So they were, I would say, the first modern scholars, trained in the modern disciplines, but of course also, with good training and knowledge of Islam, different areas of Islam. My siblings and myself are in academia as well. So and my children. So now moving slowly into
That's three
academia.
generations.
Three generations secured, at least 3 generations secured.
Yeah, that's right. But I have to add that it's not due to any design.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, because my wife and I never.
Impose anything.
No, we didn't impose anything. I suppose at the back of my mind was the feeling that if we did try to impose, they might
Go the other way.
reject, or they might rebel in a sense. Yeah. So I remember telling my kids, I mean, they were saying to me, don't ask us to do sociology. Just because you're a sociologist doesn't mean that you have to that we have to become sociologists. And I said, okay, fine. No one is forcing you. No one's asking you to do anything. But both my sons ended up studying sociology.
Oh.
Yeah, that's right.
All right.
Yeah.
But for you, Prof, personally, what was it that drove you to enter academia, or coincidentally, a lot of your family members?
Did your father impose
Was
on
it,
you?
was it like
No.
It was like an innate drive in the family to just have interest in it? Or?
Yeah, my parents definitely did not impose it on us. When I was growing up, we of course grew up with a lot of intellectual discussions, because this was what we discussed, during when we all got together for dinner usually. So my father would talk about his books, about his current research, about his conferences. If he just had returned from an overseas conference, he would talk about the experience. So I found this very interesting, and I guess I would say that I was interested in academia from a very young age for the wrong reasons. You see, my father was traveling a lot for conferences, and I thought that was very exciting. Getting onto a plane and flying to different countries. I thought that maybe I should become an academic so I could do that. So initially, it was for the wrong reasons.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's get into something that we want to talk about, which is last few weeks, or last month at the book launching in Gerak Budaya, you mentioned that for us to decolonize our knowledge, the first step is to criticize. All right. As a Malaysian in Malaysian society today, how could we adapt this attitude with our government try to minimize what we can publicly discuss or criticize in public, especially with the topics of 3 Rs, religion, race, and royalty. How do we navigate, Prof?
Okay, you are right that there are some intrusions from by the government on academic freedom. There is some degree of that. But I think we need to understand how it works. We can't use that as an excuse not to do good academic work, not to do good intellectual work, not to do good writing, and so on, and even critical writing. So regardless of whatever restrictions there are in Malaysia, for example, certain restrictions in the universities, and you mentioned restrictions with regard to talking about the 3 Rs, regardless of what the restrictions are, we are not a dictatorship. We are not an authoritarian state like the Soviet Union used to be, or like Indonesia used to be under Suharto, right? So there is still a lot that we can do, that we are free to discuss and to write about, even within some of these restrictions. For example, the way restrictions work here is there are a number of ways in which the restrictions work. Sometimes the restrictions are more in terms of access to data. You may not be able to get certain data, certain statistics, which the government has, but they don't release to the public. Okay, so there's that kind. Other kinds of restrictions would be, the universities would not agree to students organizing certain events, because the universities regard these events as too leftist. I've heard recently from one of the public universities. They wanted to, to organize a series of lectures and talks. They did not get the green light from the university authorities because they said that, these sound rather leftist, all right? So, but the students are free to organize outside of campus, right? Now, if you are living in a dictatorship, the minute the authorities know that you are on the left, you will be blacklisted. You will have trouble. You may lose your status as a student. You may be detained. Now that doesn't happen in Malaysia. The worst that happens is the institution like the university won't let you organize, but you can do it outside. And in fact, we see students are, because they are dissatisfied with conditions on campus, they are actually organizing things outside off campus. Many students and young people are involved with indie presses. Gerak Budaya is an old one; it's quite established, but there are many other smaller. You've got Lestari Hikmah, you've got Kawa Buku, you've got several, and they are organizing things on their own. And there you have very vibrant, lively, and even critical discussions. So we can't use the restrictions. Then restrictions are not good. They should be criticized, but they're not an excuse for us not to do good work.
All right, Prof. Just picking up on something that you mentioned last year in Reimagining Southeast Asian History. You said society in the archipelago, the Malay archipelago, is seen mainly through the lens of ethnicities instead of class, particularly in Malaysia. Now, politicians are successfully convinced one group of, let's say, a race, that the enemy is the other race. They have this siege mentality, so to speak. How could our society move forward and move on from these and deal with these problems, in your personal opinion?
Well, I think this is where the role of academics comes in. That, first of all, the academics themselves need to be on board this idea that the problem is not ethnic. It's not ethnic. The fundamental conflict in this society, the fundamental problems in our society are not caused by the exploitation of one ethnic group by another. I think certain groups with vested interests want people to think that way because they want people to vote along ethnic lines. I think the more fundamental problem is actually more along the lines of class exploitation. When I say class exploitation, what I mean is you have a small number of people, a very tiny percentage of people, and this is everywhere in the world almost, who own capital and control capital. And the rest are forced, they don't own any capital, they work for salaries, but the vast majority of people work for wages. And the nature of their jobs, is very routine. It's sort of boring. They live from paycheck to paycheck. This is what in Malaysia we call the B40, right? Now, the people who own capital is a multi-ethnic group of people. They don't know. They don't believe in that this is an ethnic problem. Mm-hmm. They work very well together, right? In terms of their relations with each other, in terms of investments, in terms of entrepreneurship. They don't think in ethnic terms. But it's interesting that they want the rest of the population to think in ethnic terms and to think that one ethnic group is the enemy of the other. If the B40 and even the B80, the bottom 80% of the population think in class terms, then voting is going to be very different. And politics in the country will be very different. Race-based political parties will become obsolete, right? And to win elections, a party has to think about the economic issues. They won't be able to play the race game anymore, right? So I think thinking along the lines of class is quite dangerous for the survival of the existing, political parties that we have, which is basically race and increasingly religion based. So the question is how you get people to think along class lines. That's where the role of intellectuals come in. They have to play the role in terms of educating people, and it can't be restricted to the universities. We can teach these things to our students, but can we go beyond? Can we go to off campus to people, the general population who live in different, who come from different walks of life, who have different occupations, different levels of interest, many of whom are not academically inclined. Maybe they don't read so much. Can we communicate these kinds of ideas about the need to think along class rather than ethnic lines to the ordinary person on the street? So you need a more. It requires academics to be able to express themselves in ways that non-academics can understand. And I think we lack that talent among our academics, to be able to speak, to speak about complex ideas in a way that anyone can understand.
I think that's why we have Prof here, right?
Yeah, of course. But I think just to add on to that, Prof, because obviously the first port of call when it comes to a class discussion, people would whip out Marx or Engels as a way to further that discussion. But normally we've seen already that kind of rhetoric being pushed in, let's say, the West, right? How can we be a bit more decolonized in this sense to make it more localized that the northern Malaysians would be able to understand, of course? How would we go about that?
Okay, you mentioned Marx. So when you talk about class, then people think of socialism, they think of Marxism, they think of Marx, they think of communism, and then you are being those who speak that way, who will be sort of branded as communists and therefore evil and dangerous. Right? So I think it's a misconception. When you talk about class, it doesn't necessarily refer to Marx. Many people during Marx's time, and many of the socialists, there were many socialists who were not Marxists, and they weren't critical of Marx, and they spoke about class as well. Secondly, we ought not to demonize Marx. There were many problems with Marx, right? But Marx hardly talked about communism. He, in the thousands of pages that he wrote, he was mainly talking about capitalism and criticizing capitalism. The number of pages he wrote about communism are very few, right? And he never lived during a communist period. Communism emerged as a system after he died. So most of his writing was against capitalism and the exploitative nature of capitalism. And we have to understand that many of the things that we take for granted in our society emerged because of Marx and the critique against capitalism by Marx and his colleagues and his followers later on. For example, we accept the idea of minimum wage and we fight for it. This comes from the Marxists. It comes from the early communists from the 19th century. They were fighting for these, for minimum wage. The idea of social security. Again, this came because of the pressure from the communists. So we have to recognize that there are certain things that Marx and his followers pushed for, which have become part of our reality and something that we expect, even though we live in a capitalist society. And Labor Day, May 1st.
May 1st.
This comes also from the influence of the Communist International. So we are not as anti-Marxist as you might think.
Well, the other divide also, Prof, apart from ethnicity, is religion as well. So I think 10 years ago in a forum in KL, you and I quote, you said, Islam does not specify an economic and political system. The whole idea of an Islamic state is contrary to Islamic tradition. Could you expound on this statement and tell the others who are still fantasizing about having this so-called Islamic state?
Before that, I wanted to just mention
please.
something earlier, because when we approach ideas, we need to be critical. And you mentioned decolonization, right? So even when it comes to Marx, there's an aspect of Marx which is relevant, critique of capitalism, and many of the things that we have in our society today, like minimum wage and so on, are things that came from out of the influence of Marx. But we also have to realize the aspects of Marx which are problematic, which we need to reject. Marx was anti-religion. He had very prejudicial views against Islam in particular, right? So in that sense, he was a product of his time. He was Eurocentric. So we need to be clear, where we agree and where we disagree, right? And the same thing applies to Islamic tradition. Certain fundamental aspects of our religion we accept and we don't question, right? But then when it comes to the kind of economic system we should have, when it comes to the kind of political system we should have, we cannot be dogmatic. And the fact is, Islam does not specify an economic system, neither does it specify a political system. What it does specify is certain values. There are certain perennial values, certain universal values that should underlie any economic system or political system that Muslims would put in place. But the actual system is not specified. Islam doesn't specify a monarchy. It doesn't specify democracy. It does not specify in economic terms, a capitalist system or a socialist system, or any of the other systems that existed in the Muslim world prior to the rise of capitalism in the pre-modern period. Islam does not specify. So you find that in the Muslim world, throughout the centuries, and in different geographies, in the Ottoman lands, in Persia in pre-modern times, or in the Arab world during the Abbasid period, you actually had different economic systems. In the early days of Islam, during the Prophet's time, it was more of a mercantilistic system, very small state. By the time of Sayyidina Umar, it expanded and covered agrarian lands with large-scale agriculture. So it became more like an agrarian caliphate. And later on, during the Umayyad and Abbasid periods, they were more like agrarian empires with different kinds of economic systems within it. You had large-scale agriculture. You also had pastoral, nomadic communities. These were people living from animal husbandry and from pastoralism, and moving around. They were nomads. So there are different economic systems, even coexisting at the same time. At the same time, you had mercantilism, you had trade, traders doing international trade. And Muslims did control international trade, Indian Ocean, from East Africa, from places like Zanzibar to Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, to Surat in Western India, to the Malay world. For centuries, Muslims actually dominated the trade using commercial techniques derived from Islamic law, right? In international commercial techniques. But throughout this period, there was no one economic system that was in place, and there's no one political system that was in place. You had caliphates in the earlier periods. You had sultanates. You had in the Malay world, you had agrarian empires like Majapahit or Kedah, but you also had city-states like Malacca or Aceh, and so on and so forth. So that's what I mean. So you cannot dream up an Islamic state. And of course, what they mean, what some people who subscribe to the idea of an Islamic state mean, is that it is a state founded on Sharia. But when you look at the record throughout Islamic history, there was never a state that was purely based on Sharia. The Muslim rulers, the polity was always based on a combination of legal systems. There was Sharia, but they knew that Sharia was not sufficient, because Sharia only covers a few, few areas of life. There's so many areas of life that Sharia does not cover. So you find that whether it is Malacca in the 15th century, or the Umayyads or the Abbasids or the Safavids in Persia, or the Ottomans in Turkey, there would always be a combination of Sharia and urf, or what we call in the Malay world adat, customary law, and kanun law, which would be basically decrees by the ruler. And why do they do it that way? Because you needed to have laws that you do not find in the Sharia in order to deal with issues that are not covered.
Just like today, right?
Like
Just like
today.
today.
Exactly. So what makes the system Islamic? The values underlying the legal system and the conduct of the rulers. Are the rulers moral? Are they clean from corruption? That's all. If you've got clean rulers, everything falls into place. Then you have justice.
Yeah, I guess you're talking about this interplay between the sedentary and non-sedentary, like how Ibn Khaldun would answer it. But we'll get back to that later when it comes to your focus on Ibn Khaldun.
Yeah.
But I'm just picking up on this idea of colonization, decolonization. So we're talking about hegemonic orientations of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
And this Eurocentrism, androcentrism, Orientalism as well, right?
Yeah.
But because me and Hafiz are from Sabah, right? So we also have our own localized forms of orientations where we regard it as colonization from the Malay hegemon over the Borneo states, right? So in the context of nation building, right? How do we navigate this? Because I think you've also talked about nativism as well, right? As opposed to something grander.
Yeah.
How do, like you said, balance of a lot of different types of laws at the same time?
Yeah.
But we've seen in the current modern Malaysia, it doesn't seem to have garnered that much respect. There seems to be a hegemon emanating from Malaya over to Sabah and Sarawak. What do you think, Prof?
Okay, there's a lot of issues there. Maybe I should begin by saying that many people think why we need to talk about colonization, because we are an independent state. And colonization colonialism was over decades ago, right? And I think it's necessary for people to understand that hundreds of years, centuries of colonization in Asia, Africa, and Latin America left an impact, had an impact, which still, can be felt today. And that's why it's very important to speak about how we continue to be colonial in our ways of thinking. And it affects our ways of thinking. It affects our politics. It affects our lives. It's not just a way of thinking, right? So to give you a very simple example, and this relates to my father's work on the myth of the lazy native, he showed how the British and the Dutch and the Spaniards created an image of the lazy native in order to justify colonial rule. It's a bit more complex than that, but that's basically the argument. But he also wanted to show that colonial image of the inherently incapable native was internalized by the Malay elite upon independence. And we know that continues till today. Yeah. That idea that the Malays have an incapacity, and that without the party, whatever the party is, the Malays will be dominated by other races, and they will lose control of the country. This is actually an impossible idea. It's impossible that the Malays will lose control of the country, right? But the idea is nevertheless promoted, and it is said that this may happen because the Malays cannot survive without their leaders, right? So here you have a continuation of the colonial myth of the lazy native. You have the native, the so-called native, internalizing colonial ideas, all right? And we can think of so many areas of life where we continue to think in a colonial way. Let me ask you. Oh, you're from Sabah, right? Okay,
We're both from Sabah.
You're both from Sabah. All right. I'll give you an example from the Philippines. Okay, how many Malaysians have heard of Ferdinand Magellan? Probably
Minority.
but I think educated Malaysians probably have heard. They know right? The guy who went around circumnavigated the world in the early part of the 16th century. Now, how many people have heard of Lapu-Lapu? Okay. Now, Lapu-Lapu was the guy who killed Magellan when he arrived in the Philippines in Mactan, right? Which is a place near Cebu. He's the guy who killed Magellan. Now, we even celebrate Magellan's voyage, 1519 to 1521. So 2019 and between 2019 and 2021, many parts of the world celebrated, commemorated. But in Malaysia, did we even think about Lapu-Lapu? Now, why is Lapu-Lapu important? He was the ruler of Mactan. He's important because he killed Magellan, because Magellan was basically a colonizer. He was exploring land for the Spanish rulers, looking for resources, for spices, and to colonize. So Lapu-Lapu was engaged in an anti-colonial battle, basically. Why is he not our hero? Of course, in the Philippines he is, but he should be our hero too, right? Because this was one of the first anti-colonial battles, you could say, right? So the fact that we don't even know Lapu-Lapu, it shows that we are commemorating Magellan. It shows that, and we know about Magellan. It shows that there is still this colonial mentality. I can give you many other examples of that.
And I think one of those examples is the fact that the story never covers Enrique of Malacca, right? Who was, brought by Magellan, right? These kinds of stories are lost.
That's right. That's right. These stories are lost. But then that Enrique of Malacca, it also leads us to the other point you made about nativism, right? We can, in correcting the colonial account, where you talk about Magellan, you don't talk about Lapu-Lapu, you don't talk about other people from the region, like the Malays. We can't go to the other extreme of being nativist or being ethnocentric. For example, we talk about Enrique, but what about the other Malays and the other slaves? See, no one mentions them. We just talk about as if there's only one Malay
slave.
Yeah. And then we tend to aggrandize him. There are things that we know very little. Actually, we know very little about him. We cannot assume that he was a navigator. We cannot assume that he was Panglima, right? As the name of the novel suggests. But the novel Panglima Awang, it's fiction. We can't confuse fiction with reality. We really don't know whether he was a navigator. We don't know what exactly his role on the ship was. And there were also other slaves, right? It's important that we don't aggrandize without knowing the facts. And also, one thing which is interesting, and we don't talk about it much, apparently Enrique of Malacca was a Christian.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
That's new to me.
Yeah. Because this is mentioned by Magellan in one of his diaries. That is mentioned, you see. So we're fairly certain that he was Christian. I think we're not certain whether he converted to Christianity at some point or whether he was a Christian from the very beginning when he was picked up in Malacca. Yeah. Now I don't say that as a criticism. I mean, people are of different religions, right?
Yeah.
So, but in some sections of our society, you don't qualify to be a Malay if you are Christian, but yet they are promoting him as a Malay, right? Yeah. So to me, saying he was a Christian is not a criticism of Enrique of Malacca, but we need to know what we are talking about and understand the facts as they are and understand the limitations, because there's a lot of information we don't have about him. So avoid being ethnocentric, avoid being nativist, even when you are as you are criticizing Eurocentrism or the European bias. Yeah.
Prof, you mentioned about the lack of mention of our local or actors in this region. Is it contribute that the fact that our documented stories or whatnot only based on the recent one that we have is Sulalatus Salatin, and are there like mythology in there, like the mix of it, like we can't really accept it 100%, must be pinch with a pinch of salt. So what's your comment on that?
Okay, you see many of the so-called sejarah, what the Sulalatus Salatin, which has been called by others later as sejarah, although it's strictly speaking not sejarah, and the hikayats. You have a combination of historical facts and myth and legends. So we cannot read them as we read what we call modern history, or what the early Muslims used to call tarikh, which is really meant to be factual. But although it was mainly about rulers and about dates, right? But it was meant to be factual. But that doesn't mean that these works are not important. They're actually very important, because if assuming you're not reading them to learn about what happened on certain dates, okay, but they do tell us lessons about the values and the morality and the ethics of the rulers of the time. So, for example, when you look at you can understand the character of Hang Jebat and Hang Tuah, right? Now, it's not even important whether they actually existed. Some people say Hang Tuah didn't exist. That's not important, right? The important thing is there is a certain character, Hang Tuah, in the story, and he has certain characteristics, he has certain features. He displays a certain morality. What is our position with regard to that? With his morality, with regard to his morality, with regard to his ethics? Do we accept the idea of blind loyalty towards a sultan? These are important lessons, and this is what these works teach us, right? Now you have other kinds of works which are very important in terms of the kinds of values they teach us. For example, you have a more recent work, not more recent, this is like, it goes back a few hundred years, the Tajus Salatin of Bukhari Jauhari. This is a work that comes under the genre of advice to the rulers. It's what you call, the Muslims call it a nasihat genre, giving advice. And also a very interesting work because it is somewhat anti-feudal.
All right.
Yeah. Because it is stressing how the ruler deserves what you call it, loyalty, if he himself is below the law and not above the law. So it's very, very actually strict work, very strict with regard to the role of the ruler. Now, most people think that Malay literature, the hikayat, and the religious advice to rulers and other genres are very feudal in orientation. I think that's partly because the Europeans, the British, promoted the feudal dimension of Malay literature. Because the British ruled through the Malay elite. So it wasn't their interest to promote feudal culture. Sounds contradictory, but it was in their interest because they needed to be good with the feudal elite because they were ruling indirectly through the feudal elite, right? The more critical and I would say rational and Islamic dimension of Malay literature was downplayed by the British, although the works were there. So you hardly hear any mention of Tajus Salatin, for example, and other similar works. It's important for Malaysians to know that you have the feudal tradition, but you also have the the more critical, rational tradition, which is of course influenced to a great deal, by Islam. Of course, Islam can be interpreted and even manipulated in a feudalistic way, or the other way, in an anti-feudal way. So so I think we have to approach our literature this way, right? Looking for the values that they stress and the values that they teach us.
The lesson learned.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's quite revelatory for me because I was quite influenced by Shahruddin Maruf, who painted a very feudalistic, absolutist picture of the Malay elites at the time. I guess when you have people like Abdullah Munshi, who had critiques and was very much, observing a lot of Islamic principles and values.
Yeah.
I guess this is where we talk about Islamization of knowledge, correct? And I believe we want to do for contributions that it can bring to the social sciences and other fields, but perhaps context for our viewers here, because this word gets thrown around a lot, Islamization of knowledge. How would you define it, Prof, just for the benefit of our viewers here?
All right. I myself don't really practice Islamization of knowledge in the way that it's being practiced by certain schools of thought in Malaysia or in other parts of the world. That doesn't mean I don't believe there is a relationship between Islam and knowledge creation. And definitely there is a relationship. I think different scholars have different views about how Islam is related to knowledge creation. But I think, to make it a bit simple, there's a whole process of research and writing. There is a selection of a topic. And then there is formulating a problem, a research problem, right? So, for example, let's say I'm interested in the topic of how Islam came to the topic of the history of Islam in the Malay world. That's a topic. Now, what problem am I raising? Okay, my problem might be which part of the Muslim world did Islam come from, right? Is it from India? Is it from Arabia? Is it from the Turks or from the Persians? That would be my problem. Now, maybe my religion influences me to select the topic, right? And my religion may influence me in terms of, because if I'm a devout Muslim, I really want to understand a lot about my religion. Okay, fine. But when it comes to the techniques of research, how do you study and read manuscripts? How do you verify whether a certain manuscript is legitimate? Is it a fake manuscript? How do you collect information? How do you collect data? What theories you use? To me, Islam doesn't come in there. Because a theory or a concept is just that. There is no such thing as an Islamic theory or an Islamic concept. For example, Ibn Khaldun's concept of asabiyah, of social cohesion. It's not an Islamic concept. Yeah. It's a concept based on his observation of reality. And you have asabiyah among Arabs, among Muslims, but you also have it among the Jews. He was talking about the Jews as well. You have asabiyah among the followers of Genghis Khan, right? So it's a concept that reflects reality. It's not an Islamic concept, and I think people may not understand that, and they think that when we do social science as Muslims, we have to use Islamic concepts and Islamic theories, and I don't think that's how it works. Similarly, with regard to methods, use a scientific method. There's no Islamic scientific method. The way you do induction or deduction, you generalize from the data, or you come with premises and then you make make conclusions from these broad premises. This is what you call induction or deduction. And I don't think you can say there's Islamic induction or there's Islamic deduction. Induction or deduction are just simply the way the mind works, whether you're a Muslim or a Christian or an atheist. Yeah. this is a very complex, I think, issue. It's something that we should actually discuss in the class. Right?
Sadly, we don't really have these kinds of conversations in the classrooms about now. But okay, regarding maybe your
But if I just say, there is an important role for Islam, right? And indeed for anyone who is religious, whatever your religion is, I think our choice of topics, what we want to research on, should be guided by our value system. Because we study something not simply for the sake of studying, because we want to bring some positive change to our society, right? So what we choose is important. Of course, obviously, sometimes we study things because they are simply interesting, right? So, for example, let's say I'm interested in what are the different methods of making coffee in the Muslim world. Because the Yemenis discovered the coffee from the Ethiopians, and coffee is derived from the Arabic word kahwa, and coffee was exported and became popular. It was exported from the port of Mocha in Yemen, hence the term Mocha coffee, right? Okay, but then coffee evolved. Made in so many different ways. Among the Muslims, among the Arabs, the Turks, and also in Europe, it also further evolved, right? So it's very interesting, to understand what's the difference between espresso and latte, but also the Turkish, so-called Turkish coffee. That's a different style of making. And then you have in Java kopi tubruk, right? Okay, now maybe not important in terms of changing people's lives. It's just interesting, right? Okay, so no harm in doing that. But our community of scholars must also be involved in research on issues that are important to our lives. For example, corruption is an important issue in Malaysia. Because it's an important issue, the study of corruption, the sociology of corruption, the psychology of corruption should be important fields of study and research in our university. In fact, I would say because of the depth of corruption in Malaysia, we should also be introducing it to the study of corruption to our children in school. There are different ways in which it can be done. So we must select our topics of research according to some criteria of importance or significance. And that's where our value system comes in. And if you're a Muslim, then you must be guided by the universal values of Islam, so that you do research on important things. And when you finish the research, how can we act? How can academics act as pressure groups to change things in society? Whether you're trying to change policies or you're trying to educate people. We have to be concerned with this. And to me, this is how Islam comes in.
Yeah, I don't know if Pendidikan Civic or Pendidikan Moral has a lot of considerations on decadence or anything such as that. But okay, Prof, going a bit deeper here, because we did bring up Ibn Khaldun and Asabiyah, right? This is a personal question from me, but how would I, let's say, or you, would use this concept, social cohesion, Asabiyah, in the context historically for the Malay civilization in terms of the cycle and the rise and fall? Like, for example, the successor to the Sultan of Malacca, and the modern Malay world. Would you say that we are in a new, rejuvenated Asabiyah feeling, or are we somehow moving towards the what Ibn Khaldun calls the fourth generation, the decline stage? Or how would you contextualize Ibn Khaldun to reflect the current situation we have in modern Malaysia?
Yeah, well, I don't think we can imagine that Ibn Khaldun can be applied to every geography or every period, right? Or every part of the world. I think many of our students in Malaysia, they think of Ibn Khaldun as a great scholar, and then they imagine that he's relevant to everything. But I think that's not true, right? There are different ways in which Ibn Khaldun is relevant. Now, at one level, he's only relevant to his geography, where you have desert societies, interacting with sedentary societies, right? Because his study, the Muqaddimah and his history, was really about the interaction between Bedouin and sedentary society, between nomadic and sedentary societies, and then he looked at how this relationship resulted in the rise of dynasties, and these dynasties would only last for 4 to 5 generations because of the loss of Asabiya. I don't know whether I have time. I don't think I have time to explain the whole theory, right?
So that's another time.
Yeah, okay. But so at that level, it really only applies to societies which have a strong desert or nomadic component. It doesn't only apply to the Muslim world. One can speak of the Mongol conquest of China in Khaldunian terms, because it's again a relationship between nomadic Mongols and sedentary Han Chinese. Yeah. So at that level, it only applies to that. But there's another more general level at which Ibn Khaldun is relevant to the Malay world. We don't have desert nomads, but we have sea nomads, right? We have the Orang Laut. And historically, the Orang Laut played a similar role as the desert nomads did in North Africa, for example. The Orang Laut, the desert nomads were the groups that provided military support for the foundation of dynasties. And the Orang Laut did the same thing. Right? The Orang Laut played a very important role in the rise of the Malacca Sultanate, for example. So at that level, it applies, yeah. At a yet more general level, ideas from Ibn Khaldun apply to us. For example, there's one of his ideas which I'm increasingly, being convinced of. He believed that governments as a rule are unjust, which I think is a very powerful statement. And he had the hindsight of, he died in 1406. So we're talking about 800 years, right? 800 years of Islamic civilization. His study of 800 years of Muslim civilization led him to believe that governments are, as a rule, unjust. It is very powerful. What does that mean? Does that suggest to us that our quest for just government is futile? And does it mean, therefore, we need to think of other ways to progress? So when I think about the Abbasid Empire, this is said to be the so-called golden age of Islam. That's where Muslims made stunning discoveries in various fields, in the sciences, in technology, also in philosophy and literature and so on, the so-called golden age. But that was also the time of cruel rulers. So how could the Muslims progress? I think it's because they were not dependent on the state, on the government. For example, the universities you find in the Muslim world, they were not state. There wasn't such a thing as state universities. They were based on awqaf, on religious endowments, right? So they were autonomous, and there was no government authority that had control over their curriculum, like we do have today in the Muslim world. In the Muslim world, the universities are under ministries of education today. That's not really, strictly speaking, the Islamic model. The Islamic model is they're not under the purview of the state. They're under waqaf, which basically is actually private, right? So if you're private, you're waqaf, your funding is private. It's not based on, you're not dependent on the state. Whether the government is good or corrupt, your universities continue and they progress. So Ibn Khaldun's statement that governments are, as a rule, he said government decisions are, as a rule, unjust. If we take that seriously, then we're going to think of a completely different way of organizing our lives. Yeah. So that's an example of how he's still relevant. And then the other way in which he's relevant, he said that the decline of dynasties has a lot to do with the passion for luxurious living among the ruling elites. The passion for luxurious living has a negative effect on social cohesion, right? People lose the feeling of cohesion with others who may be even of the same family or the same tribe, and we can extend that to ethnic group, right? Luxurious lifestyle is more important, and they struggle to maintain that. To do that, they increase taxes. They monopolize. He criticizes the government for getting involved in business, the rulers for getting themselves involved in business and monopolizing trade and so on. So those ideas, I think, are still relevant to us in the Muslim world.
Adi, before you proceed, we can talk all day about Ibn Khaldun here with Prof.
See, I'm being too excited.
Exactly, hold your horses. Maybe audience, if you want to know more about Ibn Khaldun, you can just write on the comment below so that we can invite Prof once again to talk lengthy about Ibn Khaldun. And yes, please, with your question before we have just a few minutes left. Before my last questions.
I mean, this is more just a comment. I guess when it comes to the state being tyrannical, I guess that means if there's no other forms of accountability, the state should be representing the people, but also there's other states to keep it in check. So there's a whole tripartite division of power. That's why we have the three sections of government. So of course, you can make the argument that Malaysia practices two. But okay, we talk about this. This is probably my last question. I'll give it to Hafiz later. So, Prof, we talk about luxurious things, right? It kind of reminds me that the global capitalist system, the market system that we kind of live in here. So, this is virtue and decadence dichotomy here that is presented, and it parallels the post-scarcity global system. You can argue it's post-scarce because now we have access to an abundance of resources that was unimaginable before. In a way, it has also fragmented society, and not just in terms of class, but locale as well. So, I'm trying to apply Ibn Khaldun again. That maybe the global Asavia is under siege by the perfume trappings of unprecedented wealth. Would this, let's say, for academic interests, be too ambitious of an application of Ibn Khaldun, or would it be actually relevant in the current situation? Because I don't think Ibn Khaldun had predictions for how interconnected we have become now.
Yeah, right. I think there's a limit to applying Ibn Khaldun, right? He was a great scholar, but he's not relevant, as I said, to everything. Yeah. I think there's certain ideas and certain principles about good government, good governance, which we can learn from him. But we can't restrict our let's say, political theorizing. When we theorize about government or theorize about politics, we can't restrict our source to Ibn Khaldun, because there are many other scholars, both from the Muslim world as well as from other parts of the world. My father, when he wrote about corruption, he was interested in some of the Chinese scholars from the pre-modern period, from the Tang Dynasty, for example. So we've got very important lessons about how to govern ourselves from many civilizations, not just the Muslims, and certainly not just Western civilization. So we need to really be broad and cosmopolitan in terms of where we get the ideas from. And I think we've neglected Malay thought. I mentioned Bukhari Jauhari, right? You have a whole tradition of Malay thought that's really very progressive, and we need to go into those more.
All right, Prof, I think that's the time that we have today. But before we let you go, just want to end a lighter note here. That maybe quickly you can answer, what is your favorite music or a favorite holiday destination, or even movie, if you have something that we want to know more, just beyond the Ibn Khaldun or the works that you made. Who is?
Okay. All right, favorite music. That's interesting. I might be a bit embarrassed to say.
It's not going to be Taylor Swift, is it?
Oh no!
Okay, all right.
No,
so nothing to be embarrassed. Nothing to be embarrassed. Then.
Okay. Well, I like a few genres. For Malay music, I guess my favorite would be Lagu Asli.
All right.
And I like Zapin.
Okay.
In fact, I even do a bit of writing on Zapin myself.
Oh, didn't know that.
But for Western music, I like some variety of blues, but more blues rock, and specifically Led Zeppelin.
Oh,
because I grew up, in that period in
your time,
in the 70s when I was a teenager. That was popular, but I can't help being an academic because I use music for teaching as well, because you can teach about social values, about social critique through music, right? And then I'm able to explore Arabic, Turkish, Malay, Western music to do this. Yeah.
How about holiday destination?
No, I don't take holidays. Not that I'm a boring person. I travel enough for conferences that I can combine it with also some sightseeing and meeting people and going to sites. Yeah.
So with all these years, places that you've been, which one you?
I don't know. I love so many parts of the world. I've traveled in Europe. I think my favorite country is the Netherlands.
Because you were born there?
Partly because I was born there, but my father studied there. He lived there for more than 10 years, and I've got good ties there, good contacts with scholars. I love Turkey. I love Iran. I travel to Tehran and Istanbul quite a lot, and one of my favorite cities is Bogor. My father was born there. I still have relatives there. I think there are so many wonderful places because of the wonderful people in many parts of the world. Yeah.
All right.
I guess for some it's the food really as well.
Oh yeah, definitely. Okay, that's it for this episode for today. If you think this is very insufficient of Prof here, please again comment down below so that we can invite Prof again and maybe specify topics on what you're interested in. So Adi, if they want to see the short form of this podcast, where should they go?
You can check us out on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram, all under the name of Kopitiam Council, where we'll be posting almost every single day.
Yeah.
So, if you want to keep in the loop, you can look and follow any of these channels.
And if you're thinking like video is too much for you and you only opt for audio, you can go to Spotify and Apple Podcasts and you can listen us while you're driving to your work. And that's it for this episode. Goodbye for now.